In the early weeks of 1823, two ships anchored off the Caribbean coast of what is now Honduras, and their passengers waded ashore, expecting to walk into the capital of a functioning New World republic. They carried land deeds printed in Edinburgh, banknotes exchangeable at a stated rate, and a guidebook running to more than 300 pages that described in careful detail the streets, public buildings, harbors, and farmland of a country called Poyais. What they found was jungle, insects, heat, and the remnants of a structure that could not have sheltered more than a handful of people. The promised city of St. Joseph did not exist. It had never been built. They had crossed the Atlantic to become citizens of a nation that one man had invented entirely from paper. Gregor MacGregor was born in 1786 in the Scottish county of Stirlingshire into a family with genuine if modest military connections. He entered the British Army as a young officer and served briefly on the Iberian Peninsula during the Napoleonic conflicts, long enough to acquire a uniform and the bearing that went with it. In 1811, restless and ambitious, he sailed for Venezuela, where Spanish colonial authority was beginning to fracture under the pressure of independence movements across South America. Foreign fighters were welcomed by the revolutionary cause, and MacGregor rose quickly in the ranks, serving under Francisco de Miranda and later alongside Sim and Bolivar. He married Josefa Aristeguieta, a woman from one of Caracas's most prominent families and a cousin of Bolivar himself, a connection that opened doors and lent his self-styled military rank a kind of social credibility. MacGregor's record in the independence wars was uneven. He led raids and skirmishes, some successful, others ending in retreat, and he accumulated titles with the same ease he would later apply to fabricating nations. In June of 1817, he led a daring assault on Amelia Island, a Spanish-held outpost off the coast of present-day Florida, and briefly held it under a flag of his own design before being forced to withdraw. Later campaigns in New Granada ended badly enough that he left the continent carrying debts and a reputation that varied sharply depending on who was asked. What those years had given him, however, was something more durable than battlefield skill. The knowledge that in the disorder of a revolutionary era, a man who dressed well, spoke with authority, and produced plausible documents could claim almost any position he chose. In April of 1820, MacGregor arrived on the Mosquito Shore, the Caribbean coastline of what is now eastern Honduras and Nicaragua. This stretch of coast had long been of informal British interest, maintained through a protectorate relationship with the Mosquito people who inhabited it. The nominal sovereign of the region was known to British records as King George Frederick, a Mosquito leader who had adopted the outward form of constitutional monarchy through decades of contact with British traders and officials. On the 29th of April, 1820, MacGregor obtained a land grant from King George Frederick covering a tract along the Black River. The document was genuine in form, a signed agreement between two parties. The land itself was uninhabited jungle with no roads, no buildings, no agricultural clearings, and no population beyond scattered indigenous communities. What MacGregor had secured was a right to settle a tract of remote tropical land, the sort of grant that speculators occasionally obtained along that coast. What he chose to present on his return to Britain in 1821 was something entirely different. He did not arrive as a speculator with a promising claim. He arrived as His Highness Gregor, Cazique of Poyais, the hereditary sovereign prince of an established republic, complete with a capital city, fertile farmland, a functioning bank, a cathedral, a courthouse, and a standing army of several hundred men. He held court in London and Edinburgh, receiving visitors in rented rooms, wearing medals and military dress, and speaking of Poyais with the calm authority of a head of state conducting routine diplomatic business. In 1822, a guidebook appeared in print under the name of a Captain Thomas Strangeways titled Sketch of the Mosquito Shore. It described Poyais in the kind of systematic, measured detail that inspired confidence precisely because it was so specific. It named the streets of St. Joseph, described the harbor depth, listed the principal crops and their yields, provided population figures, and explained the exchange rate of the Poyasian dollar against British sterling. It instructed potential settlers on the tools and goods they should bring. It read not like a brochure, but like a colonial administrator's report, thorough and unhurried. Historians have generally attributed authorship to MacGregor or to a writer working under his direct supervision. The guidebook became the central instrument of recruitment, circulated among investors and emigrants who attended MacGregor's drawing room presentations. Alongside the guidebook, MacGregor arranged the issue of Poyasian government bonds through a City of London house. The loan was structured for £200,000 at 6% interest, presented to investors with a prospectus describing the country's natural resources, governance, and growth prospects. This was not as unusual as it might now seem. The London bond market of the early 1820s was actively financing new Latin American republics, many of which were genuine though financially shaky. Poyais stood out only in that the underlying country did not exist. MacGregor also had Poyasian banknotes printed, denominated in dollars and designed to be exchanged for sterling at a stated rate on arrival. Settlers were encouraged by his agents to convert their savings before departure, so that they would arrive with local currency already in hand. The people who purchased Poyais land certificates and booked passage were not credulous. They were tradespeople, farmers, a physician, bank clerks, musicians, and skilled craftsmen who had done the due diligence available to them, studied the guidebook, spoken with MacGregor's agents, and examined the printed documents. Some had left employment and sold possessions. Others brought their families. The first vessel, the Honduras packet, departed from Leith in Scotland in September of 1822 carrying approximately 70 settlers. A second ship, the Kennersley Castle, left London the following January with roughly 200 more. Together they represented a cross-section of working Britain, people who had saved carefully and calculated that a modest investment in a new country would repay them for the rest of their lives. The Honduras packet arrived at the mouth of the Black River in the final weeks of 1822 to find no trace of the country the guidebook described. There was no St. Joseph, no harbor, no public buildings. There were remnants of structures that may have dated from earlier failed attempts at British settlement, and there was dense tropical growth reaching to the waterline. MacGregor's agents had told settlers to expect some work still in progress, but the reality was incompatible with any ordinary understanding of a town. When the Kennersley Castle arrived weeks later with its larger complement of passengers, they found the first group already camped on the riverbank, short of clean water and beginning to fall ill. The two groups together numbered on the order of 240 people in an environment for which none of them had been prepared. The Mosquito Shore was a malarial environment. The settlers had no local knowledge, no established supply lines, and no functioning medicine beyond what the physician among them had carried aboard. Their tools and skills had been calibrated for a temperate settlement in a country that had never been built. They had converted much of their savings into currency that was accepted nowhere. Disease moved through the camps with speed. The accounts that survive, including a physician's record kept during the ordeal, describe fever, rapid deterioration, and death at a pace that overwhelmed any capacity to respond. Precisely how many people died is not established beyond dispute in the historical record, but the weight of contemporary accounts and later scholarship indicates that the majority of those who came ashore did not survive the months that followed. The toll was, by any measure, catastrophic. Survivors who could be moved were eventually taken off the coast by passing vessels and brought to Belize, then administered as British Honduras. Their accounts, given to colonial officials there, entered the public record alongside the physical artifacts of the scheme, the land certificates, the printed banknotes, the bond prospectus, and the guidebook. News of the disaster reached Britain in the summer of 1823. MacGregor had by then placed distance between himself and the immediate arrangements. The legal tools for prosecuting a financial fraud of this scale and novelty were inadequately developed in Britain at that time, and no criminal charge was successfully brought against him there. He moved to France. In 1825, he launched what was essentially the same scheme for French investors, issuing fresh Poyais bonds and land grants in Paris. French authorities moved more swiftly than their British counterparts. MacGregor was arrested in Paris in 1825 and stood trial in 1826 on charges relating to the second scheme. The outcome was remarkable. A French court acquitted him. The defense argued that investors had chosen freely to speculate in a foreign venture, and that no fraudulent document could be shown to have originated directly from MacGregor's hand. He was released. He returned briefly to Britain, then drifted for years before settling in Venezuela in 1839, where he was welcomed as a veteran of the independence struggle. The Venezuelan government restored his military rank and granted him a pension. He died in Caracas on the 4th of December, 1845, at the age of 59, and was buried in that city with full military honors. A country that never existed left behind a remarkably complete paper trail. The Poyais guidebook, the bond prospectus, the land certificates, the banknotes printed in Edinburgh. All of it has survived in archives and private collections. The names of the settlers are in the colonial records at Belize. Some of their wills and inventories of packed belongings have been found by researchers. The account kept by the physician who survived the crossing describes the camp on the Black River with a restraint that makes it more difficult to read, not less. MacGregor understood, perhaps better than anyone of his era, that a well-made document and a confident performance could be made to substitute for a country. The record he left behind is the country he actually built, a paper nation, more durable in the archive than most real republics of its time.